Hello everyone, I hope you've been well and I hope you're ready to tune in to Talking FLS. This is where I'll be sharing some of my insights into the recent episodes of Fine Line Station, the podcast I've written and produced. This FLS will be talking about episode 0 all the way to episode 5. I'm mainly going to be talking about my inspiration and some fun little Easter eggs like names or places and whatnot. There won't be any spoilers for the upcoming episodes or the overarching story, and there won't be many spoilers about the ARG aspect of it either, but I will be touching on that every now and then. Before I jump into it, I just want to say a really big thank you to everyone who has supported my podcast, who has shared it on socials, who has listened to it, given me feedback, both positive and also just critiquing and how I could do a little bit better. I really appreciate it. It's honestly still kind of wild that I have made and written a podcast and it's out there in the world. I've been quite nervous to share it because a lot of the stories are quite personal and there's a lot of me in them. And I guess also because it's kind of a niche topic. I mean, I know that if you're into this kind of stuff, there's lots out there, right? But for people who haven't necessarily looked into the more psychological statement-esque podcast style, it's kind of weird, right? But anyway, I really appreciate all of your patience with the story. Yes, it might seem a little bit far-fetched, but I promise that all of the things you might be thinking, oh, that's kind of weird, why is that happening? Most likely it's for a good reason that suits the story. It's really funny, my dad listened to the episode 0 and he was really confused as to why the person telling the story went into so much detail and how it was being read by the host, Charlie Fox, and it just seemed like she was adding so much to it. And it's really funny because that's kind of the point. There is a reason that these stories sound so similar to one another, and there is a reason that Charlie gets so into reading it. There is a point to all of it, and I encourage you to keep listening to find out more. Jumping right on into it, let's start with episode 0. In terms of the overarching premise, obviously it's a radio show. I did go back and forth on what I wanted to do and what I wanted the podcast, I guess, format to be, because while I had these stories, I really wanted the stories to make sense in the world I was creating. Obviously it's hard because I have listened to so many types of podcasts that revolve around this psychological horror and these individual stories, so it's this kind of challenge of, obviously I'm inspired by them, but I don't want to copy them. So I've kind of tried to at least pull what I liked and what I really enjoy, just kind of style-wise, but then add my own twist onto it as well. And the radio show made the most sense, and it also suits the end goal of it as well, because like I said, while they're individual stories, there is an overarching story, and the radio show just suits that well enough. The title itself, Fine Line Station, it kind of came to me a really long time ago, you know, when you're just messing around with words and something sticks for some reason. I like the abbreviation FLS as well. Fine line obviously is like the fine line between supernatural and just kind of a weird occurrence. And then station, radio station. The first time I told my parents the name of it, they thought I literally meant like a train station, which is why I decided the very episode 0 would be about a train station. It's just a little nod to that. In terms of the story itself, catching the train and then ending up somewhere different is something I really love and have thought about. I used to catch a train for my job, for university, for everything, right? And I still catch them quite regularly, and you always just wonder what happens if you go past a stop or something like that. The character itself is really interesting. When I first started planning all of these, I had some kind of rough notes for different stories and the characters that were in the stories, but when I actually was writing the full scripts, I would kind of change things here and there, and I would keep the rough story, but sometimes the personality, I'd make them maybe a little bit more abrupt or a little bit more smug or kind of a little bit more annoying, you know, depending kind of what the story wanted. And while the stories are meant to be similar, I didn't want them to be too similar, like it was the same person giving the same story. So I've tried to add a little bit of personality here and there. I think I probably could do it a little bit better, and that's something I'm realizing now, but for the most part I'm pretty happy with it. Looking at back now, I realize it was probably kind of controversial picking the first character you meet is kind of not a fan of Charlie Fox's radio show, which I've kind of done that on purpose to show that even someone who wasn't a mad fan of the show still sent in a full story. But yeah, I realize now that that's probably was an interesting start. The character's name, Jack Hayes, originally I was gonna call him Jonathan, but I used that name elsewhere. When he's kind of in that other place or whatever, and he passes a group of teenagers and they're all speaking with the normal kind of nuances of going up and down in tone or whatnot that when carrying out a conversation, but they're actually speaking nonsense. That's used. That's not an original idea by me, but I love it when that's used. I think that's such a creepy, it's like familiar but creepy, and uncanny is obviously something I'm very interested in, and I feel like it suits there really perfectly. Moving on to episode 1, which is a story by Brandon Dove, Lucky and Unlucky. If you know me at all, you probably know that my favourite video game is What Remains of Edith Finch, and Brandon Dove is kind of loosely inspired by Edith Finch. Throughout that game you go and uncover her family and kind of the tragedies surrounding that, and Brandon Dove is kind of similar in the way that he essentially sends in stories about his family and their experiences, but that's kind of where the similarities end. There is a lot more obviously to do with him, but I really love the idea of just this family, whether it's a curse or if it's just weird circumstances, and a lot of the stories really fit with that. The character Frank, my dad always uses the name Frank for like a lot of stuff. I think it's from a movie, I'm not sure what, but that's where that came from. Oh, another really interesting thing that happens is I have to Google a lot of like kind of weird stuff. So I was looking up like house fire facts and whatnot. So every time I finish an episode, my like Google search is just got the most bizarre stuff. For a while there, I was just sending screenshots to friends being like, yep, this is what I was looking into today. I knew I definitely wanted to do something about luck because I've always found it really interesting. I used to do this thing as a kid where I would like save up luck and then try and use it for different scenarios or like things in my life. Not really sure why I did that, but it's something I did. I'm also definitely a bit of like a kind of sentimental person, so I do like holding on to things and, you know, like lucky things or whatever. I definitely do that a little bit too. Moving on to episode 2, which is I Lost Someone. This is an interesting one. I know the story probably wasn't as maybe intense as some of my other episodes, but this one was one I had very early on because it's kind of pulling a lot from my own life. When I was in childcare, there was a kid there who wore a striped shirt, and I don't actually remember what his name was. It might have been Isaac, or it might just be a false memory, like my own false memory at this point, but I wanted to pull a story about that because a lot of the stuff is true. Like, he would get picked up quite early, we were really good friends, and then I don't remember anything else about him. I don't think my parents, I did ask them and they don't really remember much about him as well. So it is pulling from my own life. There is this kid that was so impactful that I still remember him today, but I also don't remember a lot about him and I doubt I'll ever find him again. I also want to quickly touch on the ARG elements as well. Again, a huge thank you to everyone who's been playing along. Keep trying stuff, keep finding things. There are a few things there you won't have access to just yet, but they'll be coming soon. At the end of this video, I might just touch on that a little bit, so if you want to avoid spoilers, I'll let you know and you can skip that part, but I think I just want to go over a little bit of how the ARG works for those who aren't as familiar with it. Alright, but moving on to episode 3, Mass Hallucination. This is probably one of my favourite episodes. I don't exactly know where the idea came from. I knew I wanted some kind of hallucination aspect of one of the stories, and a long time ago for an art project, I experimented with using text on different environments and places, and sometimes digitally, sometimes physically. One of the cooler ones I did one of those, like I did all these red strings everywhere and then hung up like cut up letters all around, and it looks like nonsense unless you stand in one spot and then it actually starts to read out something. It was a poem from a book called Planiverse, which is this interesting kind of sci-fi premise, but I really enjoyed using text in my art, and I pulled a little bit from that for this story. And I think this one's really weird because it's It has an uncanny vibe, obviously, because there is a mystery of what's going on, but it's not outright horror. And I think this story perfectly toes the line, like that fine line between, is this like meant to be a horror story, or is it just an odd story someone's telling? You know, it's very in between. I think while I really enjoy consuming horror media and like really psychological horror media, it's not something I always enjoy writing. I'm a little bit more pulled back from that sometimes, and you'll see some of my stories will be a little bit more creepy and some will just be a little bit more odd, like this one. And this, I feel like this episode really encompasses what I'm trying to say and share with my podcast. Next up for episode 4, Collecting, is another Brandon Dove story, and this one is all about collecting items and books and whatnot. When I was in university, I had to do a project on Walter Benjamin's Unpacking My Library, and it's just him talking about like his book collection and how like he hasn't read them all, but that's not necessarily the point of the collection. I really enjoyed it, and you know, as someone who collects books and collects various different things, of course I had to do a story about it. The book Masquerade was actually shared to me by an old work colleague as well. I had never heard of it before, but once I found that, and then I went down the rabbit hole of armchair mysteries and all of that. Back in the day as well, I did the Magnus Archive inspired video where I essentially wrote my own statement. I knew I wouldn't be able to fully put it into this story because it was, again, a little bit more too horror than what I was actually working with, but essentially it was about this girl who loved collecting things, and especially like thrift shops, and talking about like Leitner's books, which is a premise in the Magnus Archive, and her sister goes missing. And while I didn't include everything from that, I did keep a lot of the collecting atmosphere and that vibe as well for this story. Generally, there's a lot of nods to my own life and things in my own life. So for example, in this story, I talk about a candle holder with like a winter scene. That is something I own. The embroidered painting that's on the wall that they talk about as well is something my grandparents have, which I really enjoy and had to put in there. And then the book about Ariadne and the Minotaur is also a book I read that I've, forgotten the name of and have never been able to find again. Episode 5, The Quarry, is another one of my favourite ones. Again, I knew I wanted an episode to be revolved around a quarry and a group of friends. When I first had started planning it, it was actually going to be more of like a murder mystery type thing, which I still love the idea of, but it was a little bit too extreme for what my other past episodes had been. I kind of went back and forth on this story quite a lot. I think it's probably one of the ones I spent the longest on. Sometimes with stories it was really easy for me to kind of write the entire script, but then others I kind of had to go back and forth, and I had to do a couple of drafts before I kind of had what I wanted, and this was definitely one of those. I also had kind of merged two stories together. The idea that one of the characters is being haunted because of Beta Meinhof, which is like when you start seeing things appear because you started talking about them, but it's more your brain just kind of picks up the pattern or whatever. I knew I wanted to include that in a story, and I originally wasn't going to be part of this one, but it just kind of fit nicely in the end, so I went with it. Sometimes what I would do for these stories is I had kind of base ideas for the like 26 stories, 27 stories, whatever, and then I would write down just some really interesting things that I liked researching or wanted to use in some capacity. You will notice there's like a lot of real world stuff pulled as well as not, my own fiction, and I did that on purpose. And so, for example, the observer effect is one I looked into. Interestingly enough, I actually pulled that from one of my favorite book series, the Stormlight Archive. There's just a note in there about how a watched spren behaves differently, and that's part of the magic system, but it's the idea that watching something will then change it, right? And then obviously that led me to observer effect, and then down the other kind of various rabbit holes. This one was interesting. It was kind of near the end that I came up with the idea that the main character wanted to observe the stars without the stars realizing, and it took a while. I had to brainstorm with Dad a little bit of the best way to actually do that, and the very last one about the two-way mirror, a very simple but potentially genius idea, right? And that are some fun facts between episode 0 and episode 5 of Fine Line Station. Hope you enjoyed learning a few little insights about the story and my inspiration and whatnot. Eventually I will do some Q&As to answer more specific questions, but this is probably a nice way to kind of peek behind the curtain and just learn a little bit more about me and what I'm writing. Again, thank you so much for listening and tuning in, and I really appreciate all of you. Before I go, I'm just going to have a quick chat about the ARG elements. Again, ARG, alternate reality game, is when I start hiding clues or sentences or phrases or words inside my podcast. You may have already heard a few little distortion sounds, which then leads you over to the finelinestation.com website. Generally, if you do finelinestation/something, that'll lead you to a special page. I'll give you the first one just because it can be a little bit tricky, but hopefully this explains a little bit better how it works. So with episode 0, The Wrong Train, the character is called Jack. There are probably a few things you could have tried. You could have tried /Hayes, his last name, to no regard, or maybe you could have tried /train, again, nothing. But if you do /Jack, you might just find something interesting. Again, this is not an essential part of the story, but it can definitely give you a few hints as to what I'm leading you towards. This story isn't going to be perfectly wrapped up in every single way. It is meant to be a little bit of you, how you've interpreted the works, the vibe and the aesthetic that's kind of mixed in with this story, and then you taking all of that and adding your own answers. Don't worry, the main mysteries will be solved and there'll be enough there for you able to understand the full story, but just some of those little bits and pieces or some of the motivations are up to you to interpret, and that's definitely something I always really enjoy because you always bring your own life stories and whatnot when you're listening or taking in media, and I really want that to be a part of my story as well. You, the listener, are part of my story. But anyway, that is the end of Talking FLS episode 1. I'll talk to you next time, and I hope you continue listening on. Thank you. Bye.